You may note that this conference is being recorded. I now welcome our session presenters Vaibhav Parikh, leader TMT practice, also heads our US operations and is based out of our New York office. Kamath, leader in the firm's TMT practice. Siddharth Sarangal, senior member of the TMT practice. Puja Saha. Puja is a member of the TMT practice. Over to you, Vaibhav, our moderator this evening.
Thank you, Mamta. Welcome, everyone. As Mamta said, you can start asking questions in the chat box throughout the session. We'll pick it up. Try to don't wait till end of the session. Otherwise, we may not be in a position to take your questions. Also, if there are too many questions, we will pick few of them and address remaining ones offline on one-on-one basis. With that, let me start about the session. Today, we are covering non-voice aspect of telecom regulations. You know, when we think about telecom, we always think about the telcos and the fight between, let's say, Airtel, Reliance, Jio, Vodafone Idea, etc. But there are a lot of other interesting aspects under in telecom regulations which go under the radar, and we will try to cover some of them today. We will be covering public Wi-Fi. We will be covering M2M as machine-to-machine language, which is kind of related to IoT in some sense. We will cover OSP, which is other service provider. We will also cover anti-spam. We will cover OTT, which is over-the-top regulation, again from telecom regulation perspective, and a couple of other ones. So this is typically what we plan to cover today. What we will do is we will take each topic and kind of give you a broad overview of what is happening and what are the challenges which we are seeing in this particular space. With that introduction, let me first go to Siddharth. Siddharth, can you recently, TRA has actually done, come out with a paper on public Wi-Fi. Can you can you elaborate a little bit on the public Wi-Fi and where are we on this space?
Sure, Vaibhav, thank you. Yes, so TRAI and the government of India have recently been considering increasing the proliferation of broadband in the country, realizing the importance of high-speed broadband access and the fact that a lot of people have now recently bought smartphones and want to be connected to the internet for various purposes. Particularly, video has been a major driving factor for internet adoption across India. So the one scheme that the government has been working on is the BharatNet scheme, which is the wired broadband connectivity scheme. But they also realize the importance of having to augment wired broadband with wireless connectivity, largely because deploying wired broadband has its own set of challenges. First of all, like the equipment is very expensive to deploy and maintain, and there's also right-of-way restrictions where you have to actually be able to lay down the cable in public spaces. So Wi-Fi, wireless internet connectivity becomes much cheaper to deploy and to maintain and to deploy it at scale, in fact, to be able to allow lots of people to connect to the internet at the same time. But some problems still remain in large-scale Wi-Fi deployment, which TRAI really wants to address with these consultations. One is that user authentication needs to be sorted out so that the registration flow is seamless. Most people may not be able to jump through 2 or 3 or 4 different hoops in order to be able to connect to the internet. Payment mechanism is an important area because while providing free Wi-Fi is the ideal situation, it may not be possible for commercial players to be able to provide their services for free. So seamless payment mechanisms need to be sorted out. We don't still seem to have a straightforward solution to it just yet. And finally, TRAI had also recommended very recently, but some of the spectrum that has been reserved globally for Wi-Fi has still not been delicensed in India just yet. That is also part of TRAI's recommendations to be able to do that. Now, moving on from this, TRAI had come up with like a model and it had identified certain stakeholders in this model that will be part of this ecosystem. So we would need somebody. So this, first of all, this represents a large commercial opportunity for a lot of people who are interested in being part of the internet business. So some of those stakeholders they identified was somebody to be able to handle registry of the users, which will involve logins and passwords and KYC requirements. Someone to actually operate the hotspot itself, where Wi-Fi will be provided. Someone to provide for the payment services. So there are a number of stakeholders that go into even coming up with large-scale Wi-Fi deployment. Another issue is KYC. You know, how do you, because there's a requirement for anybody to be able to access the internet to provide their identification. But how do you do this in a seamless manner over a mobile phone? So they're looking into being able to send OTPs in order to authenticate identities. Finally, TRIAD also recommended setting up public data offices, which would sort of like function like your STD offices that we used to have, where people could walk up to a little store and maybe pay like 10 rupees or 20 rupees for a certain amount of internet connectivity. Crucially, TRIAD suggested that this should be done without them being required to obtain a license and just tie up with internet service providers. So needless to say, TRIAD seems to be moving in just about the right direction to focus on internet and Wi-Fi deployment. Because this was only at a consultation stage and it's only been at the recommendation stage to the DOT right now, we still have to wait and see how the DOT takes up these recommendations.
Thank you, Siddharth. I think where TRAI is going towards, really speaking, is trying to get seamless internet connectivity between multiple Wi-Fi providers. So, for example, when we are going through the market, right, we are currently relying on our data connection, 4G data connection as of today, or 3G data connection, right, depending on which area you are in, for getting your internet access. Now, we all know that Wi-Fi is a lot more powerful than some of the data connections we get. Also, in some cases, we don't get data connection because the signals are weak. There is always an issue of tower coverage. And on the other hand, Wi-Fi will become easier because of the fixed line optical fibers which are coming all over the place now. The real issue has been that if I am in one Wi-Fi zone and if I move to another Wi-Fi zone, it is not seamless in nature. And if I am in one Wi-Fi zone and I am in a zone where I get good data coverage, then it's not seamless in nature. How do you make it seamless so that your whole internet connectivity experience becomes very easy, and you get good strength data signal or Wi-Fi signal wherever you go? So this is the objective which TRAI is trying to solve. But as Siddharth mentioned, there are a lot of issues which involve KYC authentication, etc. So how do that make that work, right? And that is what is being kind of resolved. Hopefully, we will see some action here, and that will really help us get much better data coverage, internet coverage when one is on road. Then let me come to another topic on M2M, which is machine-to-machine coverage. As you know, we all know about IoT, the Internet of Things, and Internet of Things is nothing but one machine talking to another machine. M2M is what Indian Telecom department also calls. It may be slightly different than IoT to some extent, but somewhat a broader aspect of in which IoT can become a subset. So M2M is machine-to-machine communication. Now, when you talk about all devices talking to each other, they can either talk through Wi-Fi, because they will need connectivity, and it can be either be Wi-Fi or it can be the data connection. And if it's a data connection, it's a telecom data connection, you will need some kind of SIM card. And that does create some kind of regulatory issues. And what I would like to do is I would like to invite Puja to kind of tell a little bit about M2M and what steps government or regulator has taken for M2M communication and where it is typically used. Puja?
Yes. Thank you, Vaibhav. So in case of machine-to-machine devices, what happens is that these SIM that are used are usually embedded in the device at the time of manufacturing. So there is no visibility on who the prospective end customer is going to be, and these devices are easily transferable from one user to the another. But in India, the telecom service providers are required to do tele-verification uh, prior to activation of a SIM card. When we use SIM card for our mobile phone, which are traditional SIM, there is a tele-verification requirement prior to activation, and the mobile connections are not transferable. So there were certain issues faced in the industry. Realizing these issues, DOT released its guideline in 2018 on provisions of eSIM, that is embedded SIM, for machine-to-machine communication only. And these guidelines were further amended in 2019. As per this guideline, eSIMs can be procured by an entity offering M2M services through an authorized telecom service provider. The M2M service provider has to be an Indian entity, because in India, a SIM can only be procured by a domestic entity or an individual, other than in cases of foreign tourists, where basically foreign tourists can procure SIM card, temporary SIM cards, which they can use for a maximum period of 3 months. So the TSP will issue the SIM card to the M2M service provider in the name of the M2M service provider, and the TSP, the telecom service provider, basically has to do the KYC prior to the issuance of such SIM. And the KYC has to be done as per the process that is laid down under the bulk connection procurement process, or KYC can also be alternatively done based on Aadhaar-based eKYC. So basically what happens is that the ownership of the SIM will always rest with the M2M service provider. And hence there are certain obligations on the M2M service provider, which is that the service provider has to maintain the details of the device, that is the model number, the registration number, the IMEI number, and it also has to maintain the details of the end customer, that is the customer who owns the device, who is in the physical custody of the device, basically. And they also have to provide a certain database containing all these details to the TSP. In future, since the devices are easily transferable, if the device is transferred from one person to another, then an obligation has been placed on the service provider, on the M2M service provider, to intimate the telecom service provider of the details of the person to whom such device has been transferred. And it also has to update its database. Then the tele-verification requirement, which was done after the issuance of the SIM, has been waived off in case of eSIM, because the KYC norms are followed prior to issuance in case of eSIM. And when compared to traditional SIMs, that is our person-to-person communication SIM, eSIMs has certain restrictive features. One of them being that incoming calls or outgoing calls or SMSs are allowed to predefined set of 4 numbers. And even data communication is allowed to a predefined set of 4 public IP addresses. Further, these numbers have to be provided by the M2M service provider to the TSP at the time of procuring the SIM. These numbers also need to belong to the M2M entity only. These numbers can also be reconfigured at a later stage by the TSP if requested by the M2M service provider. However, these features can be configured by the TSP only in its network, including VPN. But this restrictive features of phone number calling is not applicable on emergency calls, that is calls made to ambulance, fire. In its guidelines, DOT had only given these two examples, but they have not given any specific number or allocated any specific number with respect to this in the guidelines. In many cases, what happens is that, which is a very important issue, the manufacturer of the device is a foreign entity, and the foreign entity may prefer to use the foreign TSP SIM while manufacturing the device, which can be imported in India at a later stage. Say, for example, if a car is manufactured in Germany, the German car manufacturer may procure mobile connection from the foreign TSP, because they have to run device testing and before the device is used in the market. So for that, they may procure a foreign TSP network and use their eSIM, and that device may be imported in India along with the foreign TSP SIM. So in that case, what happens? In that case, the device which is being imported may run on the network of the foreign TSP on international roaming for its lifetime, because the DOT has not provided any specific timeline under the guideline, or have not discussed this issue at all, that what will happen in this scenario. And but DOT has actually permitted profile updation using over-the-air feature, which basically means if at a later stage subscriber wants to port to a different service provider, they can do so using this over-the-air feature. Reconfiguration, they can reconfigure basically to an Indian service provider network using this feature. And under this feature, there is no removal of physical eSIM. It happens over the air. So since there is no timeline provided for reconfiguration, those devices are free to run on international roaming for their lifetime. However, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India had also released a recommendation paper, it has released a consultation paper followed by a recommendation paper in 2017, in which they had said that, in such a scenario, when a device is imported with a foreign TSP SIM card, the device should be allowed to run in international roaming only for a period of 3 years, for a maximum period of 3 years, or on change of ownership of the device, whichever is earlier. So this is the current regulatory framework with respect to eSIM by DOT, and with respect to M2M service providers, there are these obligations which I have discussed. Apart from that, the service provider doesn't have to be licensed or registered, like how the TSP is licensed under the UL. Over to you, Vaibhav.
Puja. You talked about autonomous car or smart car, right? And we see that smart cars do have eSIMs, the top end smart car do have eSIMs. Do you want to just take that as an example and kind of tell how that works in India?
Yeah. So basically, if a eSIM with a foreign, if a device is manufactured in India, sometime what happens is that, I'll continue with the car example only. In a lot of cases, this foreign car manufacturers are offering a platform to the car owners basically, and the car owners. This platform enables the car owner to communicate with the car, with the manufacturer of the car, and with the family, and with the user who is driving the car. So there is a communication allowed, and this platform also shares certain car details, trip analysis, calling details in and outside India, because since it is a foreign car manufacturer, their server is located outside India, and they need this data outside India so that they can do their research and development accordingly. So then in this case, under Indian telecom law, the issue is that the telecom operators are barred from exporting account information and user information, except in cases of except for the purposes of international roaming. So in this case, information such as calling data may fall under user information, and hence there may be certain restriction on transfer of such data outside India. But if the data that is being transferred does not contain any data related to account information or user information, then there shouldn't be any issue in such transfer. And I would also like to mention that this restriction lies on the telecom service provider under the unified license, which is the license that every telecom service provider in India has to enter with the government, that is the DOT, Department of Telecommunication, for providing telecom services in India. So under the UL, there are certain restrictions on the TSP, and if the data does not contain this information, then there shouldn't be any issue. However, there is no restriction that applies on transfer of data that happens only over the top of the network of the TSP, and which is not being directly transferred by the TSP outside India. And also, there is no issue with respect to the location of the server, even if it is located outside India.
Thank you, Puja. I think it's a useful example, because what we see is that more and more mobile, like whether it's drones or, we just talked about cars or some machinery, industrial machinery, which can be anywhere and which do not use Wi-Fi to communicate, but uses eSIM to communicate, has some of those issues which, maybe Wi-Fi does not have. And so this is something which is interesting to say. If somebody takes eSIM, how the whole communication happens, especially in embedded space. Now, shifting gears to some extent, let us go on anti-spam, right? We know that as of today, we don't have any anti-spam laws with respect to emails. We do not have anti-spam law with respect to WhatsApp too. But we do have anti-spam with respect to SMSs. This is very important, specifically for companies which are either doing transactions using SMS, which are doing service delivery using SMS, or which are trying to promote and market using SMS, right? So they all should know what exactly they can do, what are the regulations, and what kind of process they should follow. So I would like to invite Aaron to kind of give us an overview of what is the anti-spam regulations with respect to SMS. Aaron?
Thanks, Vaibhav. So, before we get to the business aspects of this, I want to spend a moment here, thinking all of us as users, all of us as individuals, how many times during the day do we receive unsolicited SMSs asking if we want to order a pizza, avail of a loan, buy an insurance policy, or generally sell other services, and we think back as to when we may have had a relationship or subscribed to such communications, right? This issue has been going on for many years, since SMSs started. The Telecom Authority tried in a way to resolve this. There were some regulations around this whole anti-spam, unsolicited commercial communications aspect, which came out in 2010. Largely, they were unsuccessful, and I think TRAI was also aware of this. And in one of their open houses, they acknowledged that to a large extent the DND registry was not used and was not implemented as well as it should have been. What essentially has happened is that now in 2018 we have an entirely new set of regulations. We can call it the telemarketing regulations, the unsolicited commercial communications regulations, or simply anti-spam. This, as Vaibhav said, it doesn't apply to OTT-based communications. It doesn't apply to a WhatsApp message. So today, if I get a similar message asking if I want to buy a pizza or an insurance policy or avail of a loan on WhatsApp, unfortunately, the law still does not extend to such a medium. It applies to SMSs. I know we are not doing a voice-based, session now, but this also applies to voice calls, robocalls, and auto dialers. So sometimes when you get a call and there's not a person on the other side but a recorded message, keep in mind that the law also applies to these kind of calls that you get. The law which has come in has been very, very extensive. What businesses, from a business perspective, coming to what they need to do now, there are a lot of compliances that they need to do. Firstly, let us look at the three different types of communications that are envisaged. from a business perspective, right? One is you're looking at your promotional messages. These are your most popular, and unsolicited promotional messages is essentially what the law is looking to prevent. So, as expected, this is the most restricted category, and the compliances are higher for this. You also have some kind of service messages. Service messages are essentially pursuant to an ongoing relationship with a business. A business may send communications, SMSs to a user. For instance, if you have an OTT, if you have a subscription to an OTT service, if there are certain change in terms of use, if there's an extension of the subscription period, if there is, or if there's certain warranty related information for your product, all of this forms part and parcel of an already existing business consumer relationship. So these kind of communications are called service messages. And finally, you have transactional messages. The most common and the simplest way to explain a transactional message is a bank OTP that you may get when conducting a transaction online. It is any message pursuant to a transaction to to consummate that transaction or to confirm a purchase, right? So broadly, these are the three types of communications. Now, what needs to happen and what has been happening but is now further fructified is that businesses need to undergo certain compliances in order to send all of these types of communications, right? All the three, the promotional, service, and promotional. So for a start, they need to register with a telco. No business on its own consent. They need to, since they need to use the infrastructure provided by an access provider, by a telecom company, they need to register with a telecom company. Certain businesses, certain platforms may engage a telemarketer. A telemarketer is essentially a way of outsourcing this entire activity. So it is very common for banks, very common for online platforms to just outsource this entire activity of sending people, of sending users SMSs, right? Because, for instance, banks may not have the infrastructure internally. So it's very common for um, this to be outsourced to telemarketers. So if a telemarketer is engaged, telemarketers generally take up a lot of these compliances, like facilitating the registration with the telco. There also needs to be a certain header. Now, for instance, when you get an SMS from, say, food delivery providers or say, even banks, there is a certain standard header that you get, right, from in the from bar, with certain characters and a certain number, right? So you know who it is coming from, which bank or which excuse me, which bank or which e-commerce party. So these are certain registered headers that a business needs to go and do with the telecom company. So each business gets an assigned header. You cannot send any of these communications without your header, which is assigned to you. Um, with that, you also have to have certain content templates. Now, remember I said that, the main type of communication they are trying to clamp down is promotional, right? So for all these types of communication, a sender has to go register certain templates. For instance, even in a transactional, you have a certain constant part of the message and a certain variable part of the message. The constant part, in fact, in all can be common sent to all users, but the variable may be the amount, maybe the actual OTP, maybe certain communications which may differ. Senders are allowed to deviate only on the variable part, and if they don't, it's a violation. Um, this is one thing. Now let's go to who you can actually send this to and who you cannot. Now users, and I'll get into the actual implementation, by the codes of practice in a bit, which is the biggest development happening in the last month or so. But essentially, users have a right now to go and register their preference with the access provider. So there is a central registry that is coming into play. This will be used by distributed ledger technology and will record user consents and preferences on a real-time basis. So I, as a user, will be able to go and say block myself from either all types of promotional commercial communications or certain types. For instance, if I want to block real estate related messages or entertainment related messages, but I'm okay with receiving financial related messages, I will go and register my consent and preferences accordingly. Similarly, if I'm open to receiving such SMSs on a certain day of the week or a certain time of the day, I will go and register that preference accordingly. So then essentially businesses, senders of these communications can only send relevant communications to me, which I'm fine with, as per date and time, which I'm fine with. That is the short principle behind this. How this is coming into play is that telcos have been recently introducing their own codes of practice. So the law largely applies to access providers, being the telecom companies, and they have to further implement it, right? They will contract with the telemarketers and the senders. They will contractually impose obligations and corresponding penalties on senders and telemarketers and so on and so forth. So access providers, that is the telcos, are now coming up with their own codes of practice. Many of them are available on the website, implementing with a lot of operational points on how this will function. So this is something which has been coming out in the last 1 or 2 months and is being updated quite regularly on the actual operational points for implementation. So in fact, this had to come from a push from TRAI, because it was a while actually since the telcos introduced their codes of practice to implement the law, but now it is finally doing so. They're constantly being updated. So we'll need to see Vaibhav in the next year or so, before we can look back and assess, the success rate of this new DND register and how well these anti-spam regulations are working. They're still in the process of implementation.
Thank you, Aaron. Aaron, participants, while we will take questions later on, there is one specific question with respect to by Rick Mondal. It says, which specific regulation, state statute are you referring to regarding the unsolicited communication? Can you just take that one and then we can go back?
These are the Telecom Commercial Communication Preference Regulations of 2018. In short, they're known as the tCCPR 2018. If you drop me a line, I'm happy to send over the regulations.
Thank you. I know there are more related questions coming in, but maybe we'll take the questions later on. Let me shift gears and go to another category of registration, what is called as OSP, or other service provider. Other service provider, this concept came in 1999 when government had come up with all different kind of licenses, and call centers were just coming up, and they found that call centers are actually using bulk telecom bulk telecom equipment. And they said that, look, when somebody is using bulk telecom resources, we want to monitor it. We want to kind of see how they are using it, exactly what is the situation and stuff like that. Then the discussion happened that since they are taking telecom resources from the licensed telecom providers, there is no point in putting a license to other telecom services providers, but rather they put simple registration requirement, which means that the objective was that if you are using bulk telecom resources from existing licensed telecom service provider, you will go and register this with Department of Telecom so that they can monitor the usage and see how things are working out, right? And what kind of equipment you are using, how are you using. They provided certain kind of restrictions on what you can do, what you can't do, etc. So that was the genesis of other service provider. It was basically meant for application services, which is using bulk telecom for purposes of registration. It's not supposed to be an approval. It's not supposed to be in license. It is just simple registration. When it came, it was supposed to be a simple thing which people just fill up a small one-page form and that is it. How that turned out to be is quite different. While it is still not a license, it's still not approval, it is still a registration. But the way the registration is handled, you registration, if they are satisfied with all the parameters which they believe you meet for them to give you registration. So it is now acting more like an approval rather than as a registration. There are very important issues and challenges which people face. The first most important issues and challenges is who has to take this registration? Who are other service provider, right? The way the definition is that if you're an application services, basically if you are using IT-enabled, providing IT-enabled services, which includes telemedicine, e-commerce, call center, NOC, and so on and so forth. Right? Any services which uses telecom resource, then you are required to take the license. Now, this is a very broad definition. Any person who is using telecom can fall into it, and most of the businesses do use telecom as their base for providing services. So does every business is required to register? The answer really is no. In practice, what we have seen is only services which uses bulk telecom resources. While that word is not used, if you are using, let's say 100 lines of telecom to make, receive calls or make calls, right? Then you require to register as a OSP. And I'm just giving 100 as a number just to illustrate. It could be 10, it could be 15, but the whole concept really is that you are using larger number of services, right? Now it covers e-commerce and it covers telemedicine, right? So if doctor is using telephone to advise a patient, you may not require to register it as an OSP. But if there is a system whereby there are multiple lines which are available for doctors to respond to the patients or inquiries or medical inquiries, then that would be considered to be a telemedicine and you will require to do an OSP registration. So, you really look at your business, look at what kind of telecom resources you are using to decide whether you require registration or not. And that is what is the most common question we are asked by our clients. Am I required to register as an OSP? Because the definition is so wide and you will need to take a calculated risk looking at your business, looking at your telecom resources being used, and then deciding whether you should go and register or you are not required to register, and what is the risk if you don't register. Also, what is important is that it seems, while it is not covered very well in the definition, it seems to us that what DOT wanted to cover is services or equipments which use voice calls. So if you are simply using data services, you may not get covered. But now the lines are blurring between, let's say, data, internet telephony, voice calls, and hence, again, you need to look into it from a holistic perspective. So that is the first challenges which we face. There are numerous other challenges, people face in this industry. One is, this is kind of decentralized. So this is being handled at the term cell level in each city. And as a result, the interpretation of the law and interpretation of the regulation actually is very inconsistent. So what works in one city may not work in other cities, and there is no such thing as common interpretation. So this is a issue which we need to keep in mind when we are addressing that. It is very city specific, local area specific, and how the officers interpret. Tomorrow, if that officer gets changed, the interpretation can get changed. So that's the other thing you need to keep in mind. Third is that often what you see is, I alluded to it, become more like an approval, which means that you end up going through the process, you take up the form and you file the form. They want to see the circuit diagram of your network diagram of the facility. Again, let's keep in mind that this is a facility specific registration and not a company specific registration, which means if company has 4 different facilities, even if it is in same city, there can be 4 adjoining buildings. But if there are 4 different facilities, you require 4 different registrations, and you require to give network diagram with it, along with how it's going to be used, what is going to be, what kind of resources are going to use, and all the details of your facility, network facility. Once you give them, they will have several questions. You will need to answer those questions. You will need to convince them that everything is in link. They may have an interpretation that your network is not in compliance, and your interpretation may be different. So you need to go and convince them why our interpretation is correct, including trying to give examples of previous situations or precedents and stuff like that. This is something which becomes a little frustrating, but an important aspect to secure OSP license. Also, what we need to keep in mind is once you have secured OSP license, they can come and audit or visit your facility to see whether you are in compliance or not. So this is another important aspect to be kept in mind. Lastly, what is important is, especially in an M&A situation where this is an asset purchase, we need to keep in mind that any transfer of OSP registered facility may require a prior approval of the term sale, because you may require them to actually, before you use that facility, you require their approval since the ownership has changed. So this is something you need to keep in mind. So this was regarding the OSP license or registration. Let me now shift a little bit to net neutrality, and let me go to Siddharth and ask Siddharth on, can you tell a little bit on what is the position of India in net neutrality? Siddharth?
Hi.
Yeah, Siddharth.
Yeah, thank you, Vaibhav. Network neutrality, we know, is the idea that the network that carries your data, it must treat all kinds of data in a very neutral manner. It should not discriminate based on where the data is originating from. It must not discriminate based on what kind of content the data is carrying. This is an idea that has caught on in the last few years. I think it would have to start with the Federal Communications Commission in the US passing the Open Internet Order in 2010, which allowed the FCC to regulate the internet like a utility. This was not previously possible, and this allowed for FCC to be able to impose certain net neutrality requirements. Now, what are these net neutrality requirements that we're talking about? These are like the 5 broad principles, which are generically referred to as no blocking, no throttling, which means that you cannot, no blocking means that you cannot block certain websites on your discretion. No throttling is that you cannot slow down the speed at which users can access these platforms. No paid prioritization, which means that internet service providers cannot be paid to speed up access to certain platforms. Transparency, which is like in terms of what sort of requirements, what sort of net neutrality requirements and what sort of net neutrality practices these internet service providers are operating in, and what commercial agreements that they have with other third-party platforms. And reasonable traffic management. Reasonable traffic management is the fact that in certain circumstances, you may need to manage your network in a way that may end up prioritizing or slowing down certain platforms. In what cases is this acceptable? So once this happened in the US, the EU sort of followed suit very, very, very quickly, and they imposed very similar requirements across the EU as well. This conversation largely came up in India around the time when a major technology company wanted to launch a platform that provided access to certain internet platforms without incurring any data charges to people. And in this context, there was a lot of public discussion on whether we should allow these platforms or not, which led to try doing a consultation around network neutrality. This was an interesting phase because this was a very grassroots movement. It sort of took over the internet, and we saw like a bunch of different celebrities also participating in this campaign. What came out of this eventually was something known as the prohibition of discriminatory tariffs for data services regulations in 2016. This is related to network neutrality. It's not all the way. It doesn't go all the way in addressing all the concerns that net neutrality tries to address. But what these regulations effectively did, what they prohibited was that they prohibited telecom and internet service providers from varying the price of data based on the content or the origin of the data. So they could not charge varying prices or discriminatory tariffs anymore for stuff like, let's say, video, or for gaming, or for social media, or for email or SaaS services. And crucially, they could not even enter into commercial agreements with any third party to offer any such arrangements to any of their users. The only exception in this case was closed loop networks, which was which was defined very vaguely, but we sort of largely seem to understand them as private networks, sort of like VPN, where these tariff requirements may not apply. Now, like I said before, while this is one step, it doesn't go all the way to address all the concerns of network neutrality. So what TRAI did after passing these regulations were they came out with a consultation paper on network neutrality to try and ascertain what principles should be made applicable in the Indian context. In India, we face a very unique situation in the sense that while internet connectivity is absolutely essential to a lot of people, it may not necessarily be affordable to everybody. And in this situation, we sort of have to balance what we want out of a free and open internet versus how do we address the concerns of affordability and access for a lot of different people. So in this consultation paper, TRAI wanted to address what principles we should really go with if we want to go with network neutrality and if it's a good idea or not. Part of this consultation was also whether certain services like emergency networks, closed loop networks like VPN, or medical services networks should be left out of the scope of network neutrality. Because you can see how in certain circumstances you may want to prioritize the data that comes out of these services because they're critical services. Emergency networks are extremely critical services that we need on a daily basis. Based on the consultations and the responses that TRAI received, eventually TRAI came out very strongly in favor of network neutrality. It in fact even recommended making network neutrality requirements a part of the unified license that is issued to telecom and internet service providers. Some of this already exists, but not in a very concrete manner, which is what TRAI really wanted to address. Most recently, what has happened is in terms of the fact that now we see a lot of increased internet usage because of the fact that most people are working from home because of these current circumstances. The good part, though, is that even though there are certain stringent requirements, TRAI still does allow, the regulations still do allow internet service providers to operate the networks in specific ways that optimizes maybe speed and bandwidth over any other considerations in the case of an emergency. So there are provisions that allow internet service providers to basically be able to tweak their networks in emergency circumstances like these to make sure that their networks are robust while at the same time ensuring that anybody who needs access has connectivity. So one more recent development that has happened in this case is a very specific consultation on reasonable traffic management, where most of the other issues seem to be ironed out. The only scope for consultation remains on what sort of traffic management principles should count as reasonable. Because, for instance, you cannot have a traffic management in a way which prioritizes certain commercial services over the other and have that be reasonable, is what TRAI is trying to get at eventually. So TRAI is now in the middle of trying to figure out the scope of the reasonability of any traffic management principles that it might recommend. And we expect the way this to go is that it's very difficult to lay down very specific standards and say, well, this traffic management practice is reasonable while it's not. What it really has to be is a broad overarching framework of what counts as reasonable under what circumstances, as opposed to laying down a clear table of laying down a clear table that says this practice is reasonable, this practice is not reasonable.
Thank you, Siddharth. We are running out of time and we need to take questions, but there is still one topic which I wanted to cover, which is OTT regulations, over-the-top regulations. We all know that OTT players and telecom providers to some extent are at loggerheads because certain services which OTT players provide are similar to the services which telecom service providers provide, without them having any restrictions or sharing revenue with the authority on the services. At least this seems to be the telecom providers, telcos' views, that they don't have level playing field, and the services which OTT players are providing actually is similar to what services they are providing, and it kind of hampers their ability to earn revenue. Let me ask this question to Aaron. Aaron, you have just few minutes to take this question and just tell what do you think what is happening at the OTT regulation level from telecom perspective. We'll not touch on the content side because we had a separate whole session on OTT which address the content issue. So we'll not address the content issue.
Yes. So thanks, Vaibhav. I will actually not spend more than a minute on this, and then Puja will not spend more than a minute on a recent development on this. But how the TRAI has been looking at this, and there was a consultation paper floated a couple of years ago. OTT services were broadly defined or categorized into messaging services. This is like our Skype messengers and WhatsApp and all of that. Application services, which are your gaming apps, e-commerce apps, so on and so forth, and audio video content, like your streaming, your content streaming platforms. So this was how they categorized the three types of OTT platforms. There was contemplation to whether or not to regulate the first type, which is messaging voice services, not content, but messaging and voice services. The argument was that essentially these services are taking revenue away from the telcos. They essentially provide a similar service to that of the telcos from a user perspective, not maybe from a technology perspective with the last line of dissemination, and they were essentially acting as a substitute for it. For instance, a lot of our SMSs got replaced with WhatsApp. A lot of our calls got replaced with WhatsApp and Skype and Facebook Messenger calls. Right? The telcos, were putting forward an argument saying that the playing field was not level, and the prime argument actually on that was that non-telecom services should should be treated on par with an OTT provider, and that way the legs of the telcos were sort of cut off, because of the multiple regulatory restrictions and commercial restraints. So the TRA has been looking at this, whether or not they should do it. They examined three approaches that they could take. One was whether to actually go ahead and regulate the OTT messaging and voice platforms. The second was whether to relax regulation of the telcos with respect to telecom related services, non-core services. And the third was whether to maintain status quo and let the TSPs fight back and innovate and let the market take its own stance on this. So this is currently the position. Puja has an update actually from a month or two ago on this.
Yes, so as per recent update, as per recent media reports, so TRAI has basically acknowledged the fact that, the issue is no longer of financial differences between the telcos and the apps, but it is one of security and lawful interception. So TRAI has reportedly said that, OTT providers such as WhatsApp's architecture is that by design it cannot be intercepted, and it is end-to-end encrypted, and even service providers does not participate in the encryption process. Further, the regulator also recognized the fact that now India is going to come up with the data privacy law, and an intermediary guideline is also going to be amended, which is in the process, and they also need the clauses into such law before making any recommendation. And I would like to give one global example with respect to where OTT is regulated. Recently, in EU, what happened was that the EU's new telecom code has basically expanded the definition of electronic communication services to include any interpersonal communication service provided over the internet, including voice services, that is voice over internet protocol services, messaging apps, and email services that do not use any telephone number. Your Skype will hang out. However, this new definition does not take effect until December 2020. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Puja. Thank you, Aaron. I think we have about 5 minutes. We'll take questions now. So we just try to address different aspects of telecom, non-voice telecom, and you can see how many different areas they are and how many different regulations they are, and how you need to address some of those in this session. Let me take question from Suchi. Aaron, this is to you regarding the anti-spam. She is asking that does anti-spam regulations apply only on domestic service provider or even international telecom operators? For SMS, they are hitting the Indian customer. And this other question of hers is there a timeline for abiding with the content consent template submission? Aaron, can you spend a minute on this?
Yes. The TCCPR applies to foreign entities as well. There is a specific provision, I believe it is 37 maybe, that applies to this, where incoming foreign international communications need to be received, and you have this concept of an ILDO and the infrastructure to use for foreign incoming messages. So yes, there are specific provisions applicable to foreign senders. Yeah.
Thanks. Let me move to another question to Siddharth. This is by Rick Mandal. His question is, won't having such widespread public Wi-Fi bring up data security issues for user? Is there any concrete plan for preventing or compensating for possible security breaches? Siddharth, you want to take it up?
Yeah, thanks, Vaibhav. Thank you for that question, Rick. You very correctly point out that as networks scale, the security issues that go along with networks will also scale. And I think there are three specific things that can address this situation. One is that any Wi-Fi networks are expected to be deployed only by licensed providers, and the unified license itself contains provisions that require ISPs and TSPs to ensure the security and privacy of the communications that take place over the network. The second development is the fact that India is very strongly and very seriously considering a personal data protection law, which we expect will come into effect soon, within like the next 6 or 12 months. And the third thing that really addresses this is that India is also in the middle of right now revising their national cybersecurity policy. And we really expect the government to address issues that go along with wide-scale deployment of networks as well. So we should definitely see some movement on the issue that you point out. I mean, there are already some provisions that address it, and there will be stricter provisions that come and govern the issue of security and privacy on networks.
Yeah, thank you. I will just take two OSP related questions, these other service provider related questions from Satyajit. His question is there a clear definition of application services? And is it possible to distinguish OSP, non-OSP services clearly? I think I did address it in my discussion, but just for the benefit of everyone, while there is a definition of application services, the definition itself is so broad so that it is difficult to actually decide what is application service and what is not. And I'll just give an example. It's application services is defined to mean telebanking, telemedicine, teleeducation, teletrading, e-commerce call center, network operating center, and other IT-enabled services. So because the word uses other IT-enabled services, it would mean that any services which uses information technology to provide as their base for providing their services. So it can be anything and everything if you really look at it in a literal sense. But thankfully, we don't look into the literal sense. We apply basically thinking of, this service has to be similar to telemedicine, teleeducation, teletrading kind of a thing. Also, it needs to somewhere using bulk telecom resources, because that was the objective. So we apply, different things, whether, kind of business you have, kind of telecom resources you are using to decide whether you require OSP or not. So there is no black and white answer, to be honest. It's a little subjective based on case by case basis. I hope this answers your question. And with this, I think we are right on time to close. I would give it to Mamta for closing, and people where we have not answered the questions, we can take it offline. Participants, we really appreciate you having a very interactive discussion in terms of your questions. A lot of questions came in and we couldn't answer everything. Thank you so much. Over to you, Mamta. Mamta?
Thank you, Vaibhav, Aryan, Siddharth, and Puja for a very insightful and educative discussion today. Our next session will be held tomorrow at 12 p.m. IST on Founders 101 Legal and Tax Series in collaboration with TIE and IEN. Employee Stock Options, Structuring the Right Plan for the Right Employee, followed by a session at 3 p.m. IST on litigation in India during the lockdown, how are courts hearing the cases, interactive session with Justice A.K. Sikri, retired Judge, Supreme Court of India, followed by a session at 6 p.m. on 3D printing, the next frontier, legal and tax issues. Lastly, a session at 9 p.m. IST on how to litigate patent disputes in India. Stay tuned for interesting sessions every day. You can register on our website or through LinkedIn. Thank you everyone for joining us, and you may now disconnect your line.